There comes a moment in life when you realize that control is an illusion. You spend years trying to hold everything together, trying to predict outcomes, trying to protect yourself from pain, disappointment, failure, and uncertainty. You plan carefully. You think ahead. You carry responsibilities nobody else fully understands. And somewhere along the way, without even noticing it, your heart becomes exhausted from trying to control things that were never fully in your hands to begin with. At first, you believe that if you work hard enough, think clearly enough, pray consistently enough, everything will eventually make sense. You tell yourself that God will guide your path, but secretly, you still try to manage every detail yourself. You trust Him with words, but not fully with your fears. Because deep down, letting go feels dangerous. Letting go means stepping into uncertainty. And uncertainty terrifies the human heart. So you keep holding on. Holding on to plans. Holding on to expectations. Holding on to people. Holding on to outcomes you desperately want to happen. And the tighter you hold, the more afraid you become of losing everything. There are nights where your mind refuses to rest because you are replaying every possible future in your head, trying to prepare yourself for problems that have not even happened yet. You tell yourself you are being responsible, but in reality, your soul is becoming heavier every day. Because fear disguised as control will always drain you. Slowly. Quietly. Relentlessly. And eventually, life begins placing you in situations you cannot fix on your own. Doors close unexpectedly. People change. Plans collapse. Opportunities disappear. Prayers seem unanswered. And suddenly you are standing in a season where your own strength no longer feels enough. That is where frustration begins. Because part of you still wants control, still wants certainty, still wants visible answers before you move forward. But another part of you, the deeper part, is beginning to realize something painful. You cannot carry your entire life alone. And that realization changes everything. Because now the question is no longer, how do I control this? The question becomes, can I trust God even when I do not understand what He is doing? That is where real faith begins. Not when everything is easy. Not when every prayer is answered immediately. Not when the future feels safe. Real trust begins in uncertainty. It begins in silence. It begins when life stops making sense and you still choose to believe that God sees what you cannot see. But that kind of trust is difficult. Especially when you are hurting. Especially when you feel abandoned. Especially when you have prayed for change and nothing seems to move. There are moments where you sit alone wondering why God feels distant. You look at your life and quietly ask questions you never thought you would ask. Why is this happening? Why does it feel like everything is falling apart? Why would God allow me to walk through this? And the hardest part is not always the pain itself, it is the waiting. The silence. The uncertainty. The feeling that you are standing in the middle of a storm without knowing when it will end. And little by little, fear begins to speak louder than peace. Fear tells you to panic. Fear tells you to control everything. Fear tells you to stop trusting because trusting feels too risky now. But deep inside, beneath all the anxiety and exhaustion, there is still a quiet voice calling you towards something greater. A voice reminding you that maybe this season is not here to destroy you. Maybe it is teaching you how to release what you were never meant to carry. Maybe God is allowing your strength to fail so you can finally discover His. Because the truth is, trust only becomes real when you no longer have certainty. Anyone can speak about faith when life feels stable. Anyone can say they trust God when the future looks clear. But when you stand in the middle of confusion, pressure, fear, and unanswered questions, and you still choose to believe that God is with you, that changes a person. That kind of trust transforms the soul. And maybe that is exactly where you are right now. Maybe you are exhausted from trying to hold everything together by yourself. Maybe your heart is tired from carrying fear about the future. Maybe you are standing in a Season where nothing feels certain anymore. And maybe, just maybe, God is leading you to the place where you finally stop depending on your own control, and start discovering what happens when you fully trust Him. And after that realization, life did not suddenly become clearer. In many ways, it became even more confusing. Because once he began noticing how much fear had been controlling him, he also began realizing how little control he truly had. That truth was uncomfortable. Painfully uncomfortable. For years he had built his life around planning, preparing, protecting himself from uncertainty. He believed that if he thought far enough ahead, worked hard enough, stayed careful enough, he could prevent things from falling apart. But now, things were falling apart anyway. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But slowly enough for him to feel every part of it happening. Plans he trusted stopped working. Opportunities disappeared without explanation. Doors he had prayed for remained closed no matter how hard he knocked. And the hardest part was not just the disappointment itself, it was the silence surrounding it. No answers. No clear direction. Just uncertainty stretching further and further in front of him until even tomorrow began to feel heavy. At first, he fought harder. He convinced himself he simply needed more discipline, more effort, more faith, more patience. So he pushed himself forward even when exhaustion was already building inside him. He tried to stay positive. Tried to remain hopeful. Tried to believe that if he just kept moving long enough, eventually something would change. But deep down, fear was growing stronger than faith. Every closed door felt personal. Every delay felt like failure. Every unanswered prayer quietly planted another seed of doubt inside him. And over time, the pressure became impossible to ignore. He stopped sleeping peacefully. His mind would race late into the night, replaying every possible future, trying desperately to solve problems that did not yet have solutions. He thought constantly about money, responsibilities, expectations, and all the ways things could collapse if nothing improved soon. Even moments that should have brought rest became filled with tension because his thoughts never truly stopped. And slowly, exhaustion began reaching deeper places inside him. Not just physical exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. Spiritual exhaustion. The kind that changes the way a person sees themselves. He started questioning his own judgment. Questioning his prayers. Questioning whether he had misunderstood God completely. Because if God was truly leading him, why did everything feel so unstable? Why did every step forward seem followed by another setback? Why did trusting God suddenly feel harder than ever before? Those questions stayed with him everywhere. During quiet mornings. During sleepless nights. During conversations where he smiled outwardly while silently falling apart inside. And nobody fully knew. Because suffering often hides behind normal routines. He still showed up. Still answered people. Still tried to carry himself with strength. But internally, something was beginning to collapse. Little by little, he lost the peace he once carried so naturally. Fear replaced it. Fear about the future. Fear about failure. Fear about losing everything he had worked for. Fear that maybe he was not hearing God correctly at all. And fear has a way of changing everything. It changes how you think. How you pray. How you see yourself. Even how you see God. He began praying differently now. Not with calm confidence, but with desperation. Not with peace, but with anxiety hidden beneath every word. He asked God for direction, but secretly demanded immediate answers because uncertainty had become unbearable. Waiting felt painful now. Silence felt threatening. Every delay felt like abandonment. And the longer nothing changed, the heavier his heart became. He started pulling away from people without even realizing it. Conversations became shorter. His energy disappeared. Explaining his emotions felt impossible because even he could no longer fully understand what he was carrying. How do you explain a fear that never fully leaves? How do you explain the exhaustion of constantly trying to trust while part of your heart keeps preparing for disappointment? So he stayed quiet. And in the quiet, his thoughts became louder. What if everything falls apart? What if trusting God only leads to more pain? What if I am waiting for something that will never happen? Those thoughts repeated themselves constantly. Again and again until they began shaping the way he saw everything around him. Hope became fragile. Peace became distant. Even prayer started feeling heavy because every conversation with God now carried hidden disappointment beneath it. He hated that feeling. Because there was a time when trusting God felt simple. Now it felt terrifying. Because trust requires surrender. And surrender feels impossible when your heart is afraid. There were nights he sat completely alone, emotionally exhausted from trying to carry uncertainty without collapsing beneath it. He would stare into darkness wondering why God seemed so quiet while his life felt so unstable. He wanted clarity. He wanted reassurance. He wanted some visible sign that things would eventually be okay. But instead, there was silence. Long silence. Heavy silence. The kind of silence that forces a person to confront what truly lives inside them. And what he discovered frightened him. Because beneath all his prayers, beneath all his efforts to stay faithful, he realized he had built much of his peace on outcomes. He trusted God as long as life made sense. As long as doors opened. As long as prayers seemed answered in ways he understood. But now, with uncertainty stretching endlessly before him, his faith was being stripped down to something much deeper. And that process hurt. It hurt because control was slowly being taken from his hands. It hurt because certainty was disappearing. It hurt because he could no longer rely on visible proof to feel safe. And in that painful stripping away, he felt weaker than ever before. There were moments he wondered if he could continue trusting at all. Moments where fear became so loud that giving up emotionally almost felt easier than continuing to hope. Because hope itself had become exhausting. Waiting had become exhausting. Believing without seeing had become exhausting. And still, somewhere beneath all the fear and confusion, something remained alive. Very small. Very quiet. But alive. A part of him that still wanted to believe God had not abandoned him. A part that still whispered prayers even when silence was the only response. A part that refused to completely let go, even while everything inside him felt fragile. And maybe, that fragile little part was exactly where transformation was about to begin. And that was when the suffering reached its deepest point. Not because one terrible thing suddenly happened, but because the weight he had been carrying for so long finally settled fully into his soul. It was no longer just stress. No longer just fear about the future. No longer just disappointment. It became something constant, something that followed him everywhere no matter how hard he tried to escape it. He carried it into every morning, every conversation, every silent night. And slowly, it began changing the way he experienced life itself. He stopped feeling present. That was one of the first things he noticed. People would speak to him, and he would respond, but part of him felt distant, almost disconnected from the moment. He could hear laughter around him and still feel empty inside. He could sit in a room full of people and still feel completely alone. It was as though his mind never fully rested because fear had become permanent background noise inside him. Every day began with pressure. Every night ended with exhaustion. And somewhere in between, he lost the ability to feel peace. At first, he kept telling himself this season would pass quickly. He believed if he stayed strong long enough, if he prayed hard enough, if he trusted deeply enough, eventually God would remove the weight and everything would make sense again. But the longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to keep saying those words with confidence. Because deep suffering changes how a person hears silence. At the beginning, silence feels temporary. But after enough sleepless nights, silence begins to feel personal. And that frightened him. There were nights he lay awake staring into darkness, unable to stop his thoughts from repeating themselves over and over again. What if nothing changes? What if I keep waiting and things only become harder? What if I misunderstood God completely? Again. And again. And again. The thoughts never fully left. They became part of him, quietly shaping the way he saw everything around him. Even when he tried to distract himself, they remained waiting underneath the surface. And eventually, he became emotionally exhausted from fighting his own mind every single day. That was the part nobody else saw. The invisible battle. The constant effort it took just to appear normal. The pressure of carrying fear silently while pretending to stay strong for everyone else. Because outwardly, life continued. People still expected things from him. Responsibilities still existed. Conversations still happened. But internally, he felt like he was collapsing one piece at a time. And the hardest part was how lonely it became. Not because nobody cared. But because nobody fully understood. How could they? They could see his face, hear his words, watch him move through life. But they could not see the war happening inside his chest every moment of every day. They could not feel the emotional weight sitting on him the second he opened his eyes each morning. They could not hear the quiet fear whispering to him every night telling him he was failing, that he was lost, that maybe even God had gone silent toward him. And slowly, he started believing those whispers. Not completely. But enough to wound him deeply. He began questioning everything about himself. His worth. His purpose. His faith. The confidence he once carried disappeared until he barely recognized himself anymore. There was a time when he trusted God naturally, when peace came easily, when prayer felt alive. Now, prayer often felt heavy. Forced. Exhausted. He still prayed, but many nights the words barely came out. Sometimes he would sit in silence because even speaking felt too difficult. And in that silence, fear became louder. What if God is disappointed in you? What if you are too broken now? What if you have already failed? Those thoughts poisoned every peaceful moment he tried to hold on to. He became afraid of his future, afraid of disappointment, afraid of trusting fully because trust now felt dangerous. Trust meant surrendering control, and surrender felt impossible when everything inside him was terrified of falling apart completely. He stopped feeling emotionally safe anywhere. Even rest felt temporary. Even moments of calm felt fragile. Because deep down, he was always waiting for the next wave of pressure to arrive. That is what prolonged suffering does to a person. It teaches them to expect pain. It teaches them to brace themselves emotionally even in quiet moments. And eventually, they forget what peace used to feel like. There were nights he sat alone whispering desperate prayers into darkness, not because he felt strong faith, but because part of him was terrified of completely losing connection with God. Please don't leave me. That prayer repeated itself often. Quietly. Emotionally. Honestly. Because what hurt him most was not just the suffering itself, it was the fear that he was suffering alone. And sometimes, heaven still seemed silent. That silence broke him in ways he could not explain. Not dramatic breaking. Not visible collapse. Something slower. Deeper. The kind of breaking that happens inside the soul when a person waits too long for relief that never seems to arrive. He stopped dreaming about the future. Stopped imagining breakthrough. Stopped expecting life to suddenly become beautiful again. Instead, he focused only on surviving each day emotionally. One more day. One more night. One more prayer. That became his life. And survival is exhausting when it stretches on too long. There were moments where he genuinely wondered how much more he could carry before something inside him finally gave up completely. He felt emotionally worn thin. Fragile. Empty. Even hope itself felt heavy now because hoping meant risking disappointment again. But even then, even at his weakest, something remained alive inside him. Small. Fragile. Almost impossible to notice beneath all the pain. But still there. A quiet part of him that still reached toward God despite the silence. A weak but stubborn part that still believed maybe this darkness was not the end of his story. He did not understand why it remained. He could not explain it. But no matter how exhausted he became, no matter how close he came to emotional collapse, he could never completely let go of God. And maybe that was because God had never let go of him first. Because sometimes, when suffering becomes deepest, when fear becomes overwhelming, when silence feels unbearable and a person no longer has strength left to keep pretending, that is exactly where God begins preparing transformation. Not through comfort first. Not through instant answers. But through the slow rebuilding of a soul that has finally reached the end of itself. And though he could not see it yet, heaven was already moving quietly in the middle of his pain. God. I am tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix, not the kind of tired that disappears after a good day or a few quiet moments. I mean the kind of tired that settles deep inside the soul. The kind that follows me into every room, every conversation, every silent night. The kind that makes my heart feel heavy before the day even begins. And tonight. I do not want to hide that from you anymore. You already see it anyway. You see the fear I carry quietly. You see the pressure I never fully explain to anyone. You see how hard I have tried to stay strong while slowly feeling weaker inside. And God. I do not know how much longer I can keep carrying all of this by myself. There are moments where I feel completely overwhelmed. Moments where my thoughts become louder than peace. Moments where fear about the future wraps around my heart so tightly that I can barely breathe calmly anymore. I keep trying to hold everything together. I keep trying to stay in control. But the harder I try, the more exhausted I become. And maybe that is why I am here now. Because I finally realize I cannot carry this alone anymore. God, if you are still close to me, then please let me feel it somehow tonight. Not through something dramatic. Not through some perfect answer that suddenly explains everything. Just through peace. Even small peace. Enough peace to remind my heart that I have not been abandoned. Because there are nights where the silence scares me. Nights where I wonder why you feel so far away while my heart feels so heavy. Nights where I replay every fear, every disappointment, every unanswered prayer over and over again until I no longer know how to quiet my own mind. And honestly, I am afraid. Afraid of the future. Afraid of failure. Afraid that things will never truly get better. Afraid that I will keep trying to trust while secretly breaking inside. And I hate admitting that. Because I want stronger faith. I want peace. I want confidence. But right now, I mostly feel tired. So tired. God, please do not turn away from me in this season. Even if my faith feels weak. Even if my prayers feel exhausted. Even if all I can offer you tonight is honesty and tears and silence. Please stay near me anyway. Because somewhere beneath all this fear, I still want to trust you. Even now. Even here. I still want to believe that you see what I cannot see. That you understand what I do not understand. That somehow, you are still working in the middle of this confusion. But I need help, God. Real help. Because my heart feels fragile. And some days, hope itself feels heavy to carry. Please quiet the fear inside me. Quiet the thoughts that keep telling me I am alone. Quiet the pressure that keeps stealing my peace. Quiet the voice that tells me everything is falling apart beyond repair. And when I cannot quiet those thoughts myself, please speak louder than them. Remind me that fear does not control my future. Remind me that silence does not mean abandonment. Remind me that just because I cannot see you moving does not mean you have stopped working. God, Teach me how to trust you again. Not only when life feels safe. Not only when prayers are answered quickly. Not only when the future looks clear. Teach me how to trust you in uncertainty. Teach me how to trust you when I feel emotionally exhausted. Teach me how to trust you when I cannot understand what you are doing. Because right now, surrender feels frightening. Letting go of control feels frightening. But maybe control was never truly protecting me in the first place. Maybe it was only exhausting me. And if that is true, then please help me release what I was never meant to carry. The fear. The pressure. The constant need to know how everything will work out. The endless worrying. The hidden sadness. The silent panic. I place all of it before you tonight. Not because I suddenly feel strong. But because I finally know I cannot survive this season without you. God, when fear rises again tomorrow, stay beside me. When anxiety tries to overwhelm me again, hold my heart steady. When uncertainty returns, remind me that you already stand in the future I am afraid of. And when I grow tired again, because I know I will, please do not let me drift too far into hopelessness. Pull me back toward you gently. Again and again if necessary. Because sometimes all I can do is whisper your name and hope you are still listening. And tonight, I choose to believe that you are. Even if my voice shakes. Even if my faith feels fragile. Even if my heart still hurts. I choose to believe you are here. Watching over me in ways I cannot fully understand yet. Holding me together in ways I cannot fully see yet. Protecting me in ways I may only recognize later. And maybe, just maybe, this season is not the end of me after all. Maybe you are rebuilding something deeper inside me. Something stronger than fear. Something steadier than control. Something that finally learns how to rest in you completely. So tonight, I release my fear into your hands. I release my future into your hands. I release the battles I cannot win into your hands. And even though I still feel weak, I ask you to stay close enough that I never forget this truth. I am not alone. Not tonight. Not in this pain. Not in this silence. Not ever. And then, after all the fear, all the exhaustion, all the nights spent wondering if God had gone silent, something finally began to change. Not outside at first. Not in his circumstances. Not in the problems he had been begging heaven to fix. The change happened somewhere much deeper. Somewhere hidden. Somewhere inside him that had been slowly breaking for so long that he almost forgot what peace felt like. It happened quietly. Almost gently. Like the first small light appearing after a very long night. He was sitting alone again, exhausted from carrying thoughts that never seemed to stop, exhausted from trying to hold on to faith while secretly feeling afraid all the time. He had no strength left to pretend that he understood what God was doing. No strength left to force optimism. No strength left to fight his own mind anymore. And for the first time in a long time, he stopped trying. He simply sat there in silence. Breathing slowly. Feeling everything. And somewhere in that silence, he felt it. Not a voice with words. Not a dramatic vision. Something quieter. Something deeper. Peace. Real peace. Small at first. Fragile almost. But unmistakably real. And suddenly he realized something that changed the way he saw everything. The peace did not come because his problems were gone. The future was still uncertain. The pressure had not magically disappeared overnight. But somehow, in the middle of everything, he no longer felt abandoned. And that realization broke something open inside him. Tears came before he even understood why. Not tears of hopelessness this time. Tears of release. Tears from finally realizing how exhausted he had become from trying to carry life completely by himself. He had spent so long trying to control every outcome, trying to force certainty, trying to protect himself from disappointment, that he forgot what it felt like to simply rest in God's presence. And now, sitting in silence with nothing left to hold on to, he finally understood something he could not have understood before. Trust was never about having answers. Trust was about believing God remained faithful even when answers did not come immediately. That truth changed him deeply. Because suddenly the silence no longer felt empty. It felt sacred. He began realizing that God had not abandoned him during the waiting. God had not disappeared during the confusion. God had not ignored his prayers simply because heaven remained quiet. In fact, God had been closer than ever during the moments he felt weakest. Quietly holding him together. Quietly protecting him from completely collapsing. Quietly teaching him things comfort never could. And slowly, his entire perspective began changing. He looked back at the painful season differently now. Every closed door. Every delay. Every disappointment. Every night of uncertainty. At first, he thought those moments were destroying him. But now he saw something else hidden inside them. They had stripped away the illusion of control he had depended on for so long. They had exposed how deeply fear had been ruling his heart. They had brought him to the end of his own strength so he could finally discover God's. That realization transformed him. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But deeply. The fear that once controlled every thought began losing its power little by little. He still had questions. He still had moments of uncertainty. But now uncertainty no longer terrified him the same way because he understood something he had never fully understood before. God was already standing in the future he feared. That truth changed how he woke up each morning. He no longer carried the same desperate need to control everything. He no longer exhausted himself trying to predict every possible outcome. He no longer believed peace depended entirely on circumstances improving first. Instead, he started moving through life differently. Slower. Calmer. Steadier. He began noticing small things he would have missed before. Moments of peace appearing unexpectedly. Strength arriving exactly when he thought he had nothing left. Doors opening quietly after seasons of silence. Conversations that came at the perfect time. Tiny reminders that heaven had never stopped watching over him. And the more he noticed those things, the more trust began growing naturally inside him. Not forced trust. Not desperate trust. Real trust. The kind born through suffering. The kind that survives silence. The kind that remains standing even when life still feels uncertain. He realized now that transformation rarely happens the way people expect. Most people think God changes lives through sudden miracles, instant breakthroughs, dramatic moments. But often, God transforms people quietly. Slowly. Deep inside places nobody else can see. He rebuilds hearts in silence long before circumstances change outwardly. And that was exactly what had happened to him. The fearful version of himself was no longer the same. The anxious version. The exhausted version. The version that believed peace could only exist if life felt safe. All of that had changed. Because now he understood something greater than fear. He understood surrender. Not surrender as weakness. Surrender as freedom. Freedom from carrying burdens he was never meant to carry alone. Freedom from needing every answer immediately. Freedom from believing everything depended entirely on his own strength. And once he tasted that kind of freedom, something inside him became stronger than before. Not louder. Not harder. Stronger in quieter ways. He became more patient with people because he now understood hidden pain. He became gentler because suffering had softened the places fear once hardened. He stopped judging people quickly because he remembered what it felt like to silently fight battles nobody else could see. And most importantly, he stopped panicking every time life became uncertain. Because now he knew something he could never unknow again. God remains faithful even in silence. That truth became the foundation beneath his life. Not emotions. Not visible success. Not circumstances. God himself. And slowly, the very season he thought would destroy him became the season that transformed him completely. One day he looked back at the person he had been during the darkest nights of fear and anxiety, and he barely recognized himself anymore. Not because life had become perfect, but because his heart had changed. He no longer depended entirely on control to feel safe. He no longer needed constant reassurance to keep trusting. He no longer viewed silence as abandonment. Because now he understood. God had been teaching him how to trust him fully. Not halfway. Not only during comfort. Fully. And that kind of trust changes everything. Because when a person finally learns to trust God completely, fear begins losing its authority. Pressure loses its power to destroy peace. Uncertainty stops feeling like punishment. Even suffering itself becomes different because they know they are no longer walking through it alone. And standing there in the middle of his transformed life, he finally realized something powerful. The season he begged God to remove had actually brought him closer to God than comfort ever could. The waiting had changed him. The silence had deepened him. The suffering had rebuilt him. And now, even if storms came again someday, he would never face them the same way. Because once you discover what happens when you fully trust God, you never become the same person again.